Welcome to a brand new podcast. Iain McLean is a writer and the author of TJ's War. David Blair is an actor and the narrator of the audiobook TJ's War. David and Iain have been listening to their readers and listeners and have decided to turn TJ's War into a movie. And since the story covers the entirety of World War II, the movie will cost at least $50 million. Will David and Iain succeed in their quest? Follow them in this podcast series. We're going to make a $50 million movie.
This is the north of Scotland. It's the lowland area of the north of Scotland, not quite so mountainous where I am right now, but soon be heading into the mountains as we head towards Fort William. And as I get there, I want to talk about some of the stuff that went on up here during the Second World War. And why here as opposed to other parts of the UK? Well, a lot of the planning and training for secret missions went on in the north of Scotland, not least because it was as far away from Germany as possible. And therefore, people were more able to keep things secret. It was also very remote. Compared with the south of England, there aren't so many people up here to nosy around and take notice of what's going on and maybe tell others. And also, the conditions up here are fairly close to Arctic conditions. I mean, when you go skiing in the Italian Alps and the French Alps, that's alpine skiing, and you can pretty much wear a bikini or a swimming costume when you're not actually skiing. Well, you couldn't do that when you're skiing in the north of Scotland in the ski lodges around Aviemore and Glenshee. You'd need to wrap up warm to be skiing there, and you can very quickly die in the mountains in the north of Scotland. And so the training is much more arduous than it is it could be anywhere else. Maybe in Wales it can be quite tough there too. So for all kinds of reasons, a lot of the training was undertaken in the mountains and on the just offshore around the north of Scotland. And we're heading down to an area where a lot of the training took place, particularly for the Commandos. The Commandos, they were, I think the name was given to them by Churchill, and this was a group of men who were extremely hardy, very tough, but more of a military force than, let's say, the SAS or the Special Boat Service, where they trained as small groups. With the Commandos, they would tend to go in as much larger units of men. But they were volunteers all the same, because Hitler had made it very clear from the first attack by the Commandos that he didn't approve of this kind of warfare. It wasn't fair on his men. They were getting beaten left, right and centre. So he made it clear that if a commando was caught, didn't matter if they surrendered or not, they were to be shot immediately. There was going to be no ground given to commandos. They could not be taken as prisoners of war by order of Hitler himself. But that didn't stop thousands of men who knew this becoming commandos. And nearly all of the commandos were trained in the mountains around Fort William and Spian Bridge. And we're going to go there today. Now, there's also one other very good reason why a lot of training was done in the north of Scotland, and that is that up until about 1955, 5 men owned more than 90% of all the land in Scotland. Now, how did that come about? Well, during the 1700s, there was an attempt, or two real attempts, to try and get a a Stuart king back on the throne, essentially a fight between Catholics and Protestants. And the first attempt was called the Great Pretender, and that was around about 1720, and there was essentially a civil war going on at that point. And then in 1745, the Great Pretender's son, called Bonnie Prince Charlie, came ashore at Glenfinnan and raised a Highland army, the Highland Rebellion, to come down with the clans from all over the Highlands of Scotland to try and take the throne that was at that point occupied by the German King George II, a Hanoverian. And Bonnie Prince Charlie was essentially supported by a lot of people around the country, not just in Scotland. And he also had a strong Masonic support, having been made Grand Master Mason in Edinburgh on his way south. Now, a lot of the English army officers were also Masons of the same ancient Scottish rite of Masonry. And so getting south was much easier than it should have been for a Highland army. And they got all the way south to Derby. In the meantime, King George II got his son, who became the Duke of Cumberland, and who had been professionally trained as a soldier, to come across and take charge of his army, because he was not happy with how they'd been doing. And he established a different form of discipline and started to engage Bonnie Prince Charlie's men in a very different manner and pushed them back. Pushed them all the way up to Culloden, where they and a lot of other people who were not involved in civil war at all were summarily executed during Culloden and immediately afterwards. And by immediately I mean for 2 or 3 years afterwards. The Redcoats would storm all over the Highlands and kill anyone suspected of being having been a member of the rebellious army or supporting it. And having declared all clan territory as now land belonging to the king then reissued the land to his best officers, including his own son, the Duke of Cumberland, who then became the Duke of Sutherland. Massive ranges of land were given over to these men, and that is how it came to pass that 5 men would own 90% of Scotland. And then, during the Second World War, it was relatively straightforward for vast areas of land to be handed over to the Ministry of Defence or whoever else required it from the government for their use during time of war. And it was almost by gentleman's handshake that it was done. So that is another reason why a lot of the training was undertaken in the north of Scotland. The locals simply had no choice, nor for that matter did the soldiers. We're just leaving the boundary of Drumnadrochit. Soon be coming up on the Urquhart Castle, and you can see that the landscape is beginning to change. The mountains are becoming into view, and obviously that's very good for toughening up men who are going through hard training. But if you're brought up in this area, then you're pretty tough to start with, and that was what was the case with TJ. TJ being brought up in this kind of environment. In fact, he was a bit further west, where the harsh winter weather came out from the Atlantic and really bit you if you're on the mountains. And he knew how to survive in that kind of environment. He knew very well, because his grandfather was the head gamekeeper of the Dundonald estate, and as a child TJ was taught many field crafts at the knee of his grandfather. So he knew how to survive in the mountains in winter. He knew how to find water and how to trap animals and start fires and eat and to create shelter, not just for a few hours but for days at a time, because these were all essential skills for anyone living in this kind of environment before the invention of electricity or central heating or any of these facilities. That's Castleacher car park there, and I'm afraid the castle itself is probably hidden by the trees. Now, it's said that the Frasers were and are a warring clan, and the whole of my mother's side are Frasers. So maybe that's true, I'm not sure. The history of the Frasers goes back to well before 1066, when William the Conqueror came across and eventually took over the whole of the UK. Well, the Frasers came across with him. They were Normans, and the Normans were so called by the French because they were from the north. They were North men, and the reality is that they were Vikings who fought the 100-Year War against the French kings, and eventually, to settle, they were given Normandy in France. So the Frasers come from the Vikings, and they definitely were a warring race. So here we are at the Commando Memorial Monument, a couple of miles north of Spain Bridge. This is the landscape. Around the monument to the Commandos, just north of Spain Bridge. So it's like 4 seasons in one day right here. The wind is bitter. Come into the car because the microphone has a better chance of working here. As you can see, the Commando Memorial is a site of pilgrimage for many, and it's not just those who wish to commemorate the bravery of those who died during the Second World War. The Commandos and their modern form, the Royal Marines, are this memorial is for them too, and there are many who come here to commemorate the lives of people who have died in many wars since the end of the Second World War. And this area is still a training ground. Achnacarry is no longer the site, but these mountains and the moorland and the lochs here are all still used for training soldiers of many native forces today. So, heavy water. Why was it so important to blow up a heavy water plant in Norway? What was that all about? Well, heavy water was produced as a byproduct in a hydroelectric plant in Norway at a place called Rusken. And it just turned out that was exactly what the people who were trying to develop the atomic bomb for Germany and anywhere else, they needed this as a key component in producing the atomic bomb. It was required during the process to make the atomic bomb. Heavy water wasn't in the final product, but you couldn't make it without having heavy water. So the Germans knew this, and they were building up supplies of heavy water at Rusken with the intention of taking them down by train to Germany. And if they'd been able to do that, they probably would have had the atomic bomb before the Americans had exploded. The Americans and British and Canadians had exploded their atomic bomb in New Mexico. And at the same time, the Germans were producing an intercontinental ballistic missile. So the V1s and the V2s that were bombing Britain, bombing London especially, there was another one which was much bigger, and the blueprints were there, and von Braun and the rest of them were working really hard to build that intercontinental ballistic missile. And if they had that and the atomic bomb, then Europe and America could well have been taken out, and the Germans, the Nazis and Hitler would have won the Second World War. The operation to take out the heavy water plant at Ruzhkin was a joint operation by the British Commandos and the Norwegian Free Norwegian Army. The Free Norwegian Army were trained not far away, near Aviemore, and the Commandos were trained here for that operation. The Norwegians were parachuted in, and the Commandos were going to go in by glider a couple of weeks later. Sadly, the gliders carrying the Commandos and one of the towing aircraft, one of the Halifax bombers, all crashed into the mountains in Norway, by design, by the Germans who knew they were coming. The bomber crew on the Halifax were killed outright. So were the men who went straight into the mountain. The second glider crash landed, and nearly all of the men were badly wounded or killed. The very badly wounded were shot immediately by the Germans, but they took 5 away as prisoners and brought them back to full health in a hospital in Oslo, before then torturing and shooting them 3 months later. The Norwegian component, unable to attack in November as planned, went back in February 1943 and successfully blew up the plant, by which point, unfortunately, some of the heavy water had been put on trains and headed across to Germany. But another component of the Norwegian resistance managed to sink that train when it was on a ferry crossing one of the Norwegian fjords. And in sinking that ferry, a number of Norwegian civilians were also killed. But if that hadn't been done, if that hadn't been undertaken,
To find out more about the book, visit tjswar.com, and to buy it, click on the Amazon link below. To accompany us on our journey, please subscribe to this podcast, because we're going to make a $50 million movie.